Now that we have taken our container image and uploaded it to Azure Container Registry, let's take a look at one of the ways that we can run that container within Azure. Azure Container Instances, or ACI, give us the ability to run a container without having to manage the underlying infrastructure. We assign the amount of CPUs and the amount of memory we want available to that container, and Azure takes care of the rest. One advantage to this is it removes us from having to worry about managing any of that, as well as it also allows us to integrate with event-driven tools like Azure Functions or Logic Apps so that we can create more containers under certain conditions or scale back depending on the need without having to manually manage any of that. Additionally, we can run Windows or Linux-based containers from within ACI. By default, all of our containers can be publicly accessible, and Azure provides us with a fully qualified domain name in order to be able to access them. It also encrypts it using TLS certificates, so all of our traffic is secure. All of the container instances are fully isolated, so don't need to worry about crosstalk from one container to another. And monitoring is enabled by default. And since we don't have access to that underlying operating system, this becomes very critical when we're identifying any performance or troubleshooting issues. Additionally, if we need more in-depth information, Application Insights is also available. So now that we understand a little bit more about ACI, let's look into deploying a container using ACI. So we can leverage a container stored in a variety of locations. Azure Container Registry makes sense since that's what we're talking about as of late, but we can also leverage a public image hosted in a Docker Hub. Or if you've got another public repository, you can use that as well. In addition to private repositories, as well as Microsoft offers a couple built-in images to help you get started. When we have ACI, we've talked about being publicly accessible using a fully qualified domain name. That's certainly an option, but Azure recently added private access using VNets. So rather than having to access that container using the public internet, if you want the container to be securely accessed by resources within an existing VNet, you can associate that container instance with an existing VNet so traffic never leaves Azure. And you also have advanced options. So if you've got environmental variables that you need to pass to that container, you can certainly do that, as well as command line arguments. So if there's a command that needs to be ran when that container is started that isn't in the Docker file, you can pass that along to that ACI. So now we've talked about it quite a bit. Let's go into the portal, let's set up an ACI, and let's look at these options for ourselves. Here we are in the Azure portal. You can see we're in the Skylines resource group, and we can see we've got the Skylines demo ACR container registry down below. So what we're going to set up now is we're going to create a container instance. So the easiest way to start is we'll go up to the top, we're going to search for container, and you can see one of the first options there is container instances. So we're going to go ahead and select that. You can see we don't currently have one there today. So let's go ahead and click create a container instance. We'll leave the default subscription. We're going to put this in the Skylines resource group. And then for the container name, let's go ahead and just call this demo ACI. We'll leave the region as the default. And when we were talking earlier in the PowerPoint, you can see there's a number of different options. So you've got some built-in images that are available. And if we go ahead and select these, at the time of the recording, you can see we've got 2 Linux ones, as well as a Windows image that's running on IIS. We can also select Azure Container Registry, or we can select Docker Hub or other registry. And if we select that, you can see it's basically asking for the image path. And if it's a private registry, you can see it's also asking for some information to authenticate to that private registry. Since we're running a container that's currently saved in Azure Container Azure Container Registry, let's go ahead and select that. You can see it defaults to the Skylines demo ACR, and since we've only got one image in there, it automatically selects the image as well as the image tag. So if we had multiple containers in that registry, we could select the drop down to choose the appropriate container as well as the appropriate tag for that container. You can see when it looks at the container, it's able to determine that it's using a Linux operating system, and then now we can go ahead and select the size. So let's go ahead and hit change size. We'll leave the number of CPU cores default, and let's go ahead and reduce the memory to 1 GB, and then we'll hit OK. Now let's go over to the networking, and then here we can determine how this ACI instance will be accessed. If it's public, we need to provide a DNS name. If it's private, then we can go ahead and determine which VNet we're going to place that on. Let's go ahead and leave ours as public for now. We'll call it Skylines Demo ACI. It looks like that's not being used, which is perfect. It's going to ask what ports we're going to use to communicate with that container. And if we remember back when we first set up or did the Docker run command, you remember it was using port 80, or we were translating to port 80 when we ran that. So we're going to leave the default here of port 80 because that's what the container is going to be listening on. We can go to the Advanced tab, and you can see we've got our restart policy. If we need to provide any environmental variable information to that container, we can do that, as well as a command override. So if there's a command that needs to be ran when that container started that wasn't specified in that Docker file, we have that opportunity to provide that. We're going to leave these as a default. We're not going to specify any tags for the time being. Let's go to review and create. Looks like it passed all the validation steps. So let's go ahead and hit create here, and we'll let this go through and process. All right, looks like that completed successfully. So let's go to resource. And if we go down here, you can see some basic metrics. You can see it just started, so it hasn't really populated anything yet. But you can see we've got our fully qualified domain name here. So if we copy this, let's open up a new tab and paste that in. And you can see now we've got our container that's running. This is the same container that we saw running when it was on our local workstation. Now it's running in the Azure Container Instance, so it's publicly available to anyone who has that URL. So we're going to go here, let's generate some data. So let's send a bunch of requests to it. And now if we go back, now that we've accessed the page a number of times and we've generated some traffic, let's go back to the ACI instance and let's look at some of the monitoring information. So if we go back to Azure and scroll down here, we can see we've got some CPU activity. We can see the memory being utilized. We can also see the network traffic, so the amount of requests received and the amount of data transmitted. So it helps gives us some good information as far as what's happening on that Azure Container Instance, as well as if we need to assign more resources to it, or if we can pull that back a little bit to save some money. Hopefully this has given you a good introduction to containers, as well as giving you how you can use those containers within Azure by leveraging the container registry as well as container instances to run those containers. Now, let's dive into the next module.